A storm begins. There is nowhere to hide. You are miles from home, standing on an open road, and within seconds your clothes are soaked through. You reach into your bag for the thing that doesn't exist yet. No umbrella. No raincoat. No waterproof jacket. Nothing. And this wasn't a rare inconvenience. For thousands of years, this was simply what it meant to live in a world where the weather could turn against you at any moment. So how did people survive? The answer is stranger than most people realize. Because before humans learned to carry a roof over their heads, they spent thousands of years learning how to make themselves into something the rain couldn't easily defeat. And some of those solutions were surprisingly sophisticated. Long before cities, factories, or umbrellas, humans had already discovered something important. You didn't necessarily have to stop the rain. You just had to stop it from reaching your skin too quickly. That meant using whatever the environment offered. Animal hide, fur, grass, bark, leaves, plant fibers. People experimented with materials, layering them, stitching them together, and shaping them around the body. One of the clearest pieces of evidence comes from a man who died more than 5,000 years ago. Today we know him as Otzi the Iceman. When researchers examined his remarkably preserved clothing, they found garments made from leather, hide, and braided grass. His coat was constructed from strips of goat and sheep hide, while other parts of his equipment used woven grass. The South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology describes his clothing as practical and functional, providing protection from cold and wet conditions. And here's the fascinating part. Even his grass object tells us something about how uncertain prehistoric technology can be. For years, researchers thought the woven grass might have been a kind of cape. Today, the museum says that interpretation is highly debatable. It is more likely to have been a mat used as rain protection, or possibly part of a backpack. In other words, people were not walking around with one perfect prehistoric raincoat. They were improvising. They were learning which materials stayed useful when they became wet, which ones trapped warmth, which ones could be repaired, and which ones failed. And that last part mattered. Because rain creates a problem that sounds simple but isn't. Getting wet isn't just uncomfortable. In a cold environment, wet clothing can become dangerous because it pulls heat away from the body. So humans weren't simply trying to stay dry. They were trying to stay alive. But there was another solution that required no special clothing at all. Get under something. A rock overhang. A cave. A thick forest. A temporary shelter. Eventually, a roof. This may have been humanity's first truly effective rain technology. A roof is basically a giant umbrella that doesn't have to be carried. And as humans began building more permanent shelters, the relationship with rain changed. Rain no longer had to reach you. It could fall outside. Thatch, bark, woven plant material, mud, wood, and later tile and other construction materials allowed people to create increasingly reliable barriers between themselves and the weather. But there was a problem. People couldn't stay inside forever. Hunters needed to travel. Farmers needed to work. Traders needed to move goods. Messengers needed to walk. Armies had to march. And roads don't disappear just because the sky opens. So humans needed portable protection. And that is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because the earliest umbrella-like objects were not really invented for rain. They were invented for something else. The sun. Imagine an ancient ruler moving through a crowded street. People are watching. Gods are nearby. And above the ruler's head is a large canopy carried by another person. At first glance, it looks almost exactly like the ancestor of an umbrella. But its most important job wasn't keeping the king dry. It was keeping the king in the shade. Parasol-like objects appear in ancient art from places including Egypt and the ancient Near East, often associated with high-status people and rulers. Ancient Egyptian artistic evidence for parasols goes back thousands of years. And that tells us something important about early umbrellas. They were not initially everyday survival equipment. They could be symbols. If an attendant was holding a canopy over your head, everyone understood what that meant. You mattered. You were powerful. You were not expected to walk beneath the sun like everyone else. The umbrella had already begun as a piece of technology, but it was also becoming a piece of social theater. And then humans found a way to make that same basic structure fight the rain. The shape was already there. A central stick, a spreading frame, a covering stretched over the top. But ordinary cloth has a weakness. It absorbs water. A rain umbrella needs a surface that sends water away instead. Chinese craftsmen developed waterproofed umbrella coverings using materials such as wax and lacquer, making paper and other canopy materials far more suitable for rain. Historical accounts of Chinese umbrellas describe bamboo or similar lightweight frames combined with treated paper or silk coverings. Now the idea had changed completely. The canopy was no longer simply blocking sunlight. It could push water away, and that meant a person could carry their own miniature shelter. But there was still a catch. These early umbrellas were not necessarily the tiny, lightweight objects we throw into a backpack today. They could be large. They could be expensive. And in many cultures, they remained connected to social status. In fact, the umbrella had a strange double identity. It was both a practical invention and a symbol of importance. And nowhere was that contradiction more obvious than in Europe. The Romans and Greeks knew parasols and umbrella-like objects. So did people in parts of the ancient Near East. But knowing about an invention is not the same as making it part of everyday life. For ordinary Europeans dealing with rain, clothing remained the more familiar answer. Cloaks, hoods, wool garments, leather, and, above all, simply finding somewhere to wait. Wool was particularly useful because it could continue to provide warmth even in damp conditions. A cloak also had one huge advantage. You could wear it all day. You didn't have to hold anything in your hand. And that mattered in a world where people carried tools, goods, children, weapons, baskets, and everything else they needed to survive. A separate rain device had to justify the trouble of carrying it. That is why the history of the umbrella is not just a story about invention. It is a story about convenience. The technology existed. The question was whether ordinary people wanted to live with it. And eventually, European cities began changing that calculation. London was wet. Very wet. But in the 18th century, a respectable man walking through the city's streets in the rain was expected to have another option. A carriage. If the weather became miserable, you hired a coach. That created a problem for the umbrella. Why carry your own shelter when you could simply pay someone to take you somewhere? Then came Jonas Hanway. Hanway was not the inventor of the umbrella. That part of the story is often misunderstood. Umbrellas were already known in England before him, and references to them appear in London sources from the early 18th century. But Hanway became famous for being the first Englishman to carry one regularly in the streets of London. And people did not immediately applaud him. According to historical accounts, he endured mockery and hostility from passers-by, while chairmen and hackney coachmen reportedly disliked his habit because umbrellas threatened part of their business. Picture the scene. A man walking through London. Rain falling. Everyone else either getting wet or looking for transportation. And this man is simply carrying a canopy over his head. Today, nobody would think twice. At the time, it could make you look ridiculous. But Hanway kept doing it. And eventually something changed. The ridiculous object became familiar. People realized an umbrella had a very useful advantage. You didn't have to wait for a carriage. You didn't have to stop working. You didn't have to stand under a doorway until the storm passed. You could simply keep walking. And once people understood that, another problem became obvious. The umbrella itself needed improvement. Early umbrellas were not exactly convenient machines. Their frames could be made from wood or whalebone. Their coverings could become heavy when wet. They were awkward to carry. And if you were going to persuade millions of ordinary people to use one, it needed to become lighter, stronger, and easier to handle. This is where engineering finally caught up with the idea. In the 19th century, metal frames began replacing older materials in successful designs. Samuel Fox received a patent in 1852 for a lightweight steel frame using steel ribs and stretchers. The design was important because it helped create stronger, lighter umbrella structures, and moved the industry away from heavier traditional materials. That may sound like a small technical improvement, but it changed the economics of the object. A better frame meant a more practical umbrella. A more practical umbrella meant more people could use one. And suddenly, the umbrella was no longer primarily a curiosity of the wealthy. It was becoming an everyday tool. That is often how technology wins. Not by becoming spectacular, by becoming convenient. The answer depends on where they lived. That is one of the most important things to understand. There was never one universal method for surviving rain. In cold regions, people relied heavily on layered animal materials and garments designed to retain warmth. In wet environments, people developed rain-resistant clothing from plant fibers and other locally available materials. In settled communities, roofs and shelters did much of the work. In places where lightweight canopy technology developed, parasols and umbrellas offered portable protection. And sometimes people simply accepted getting wet. Because getting wet is not automatically dangerous. If the air is warm, you can keep working. If you have somewhere warm to return to, the problem is temporary. The real danger comes when rain combines with cold, wind, exhaustion, and poor shelter. That is why ancient people did not necessarily dream of becoming perfectly waterproof. They were looking for something more practical. Enough protection to survive the journey. Enough shelter to survive the night. Enough warmth to keep moving. And that is why the history of rain protection is really a history of adaptation. The modern umbrella looks simple. A handle. A shaft. A few folding ribs. A thin canopy. Open it, and water runs away. Close it, and it becomes small enough to carry. But there is nothing simple about the history hidden inside it. The idea stretches back through ancient parasols and portable canopies, through Chinese waterproofing, through European cloaks and hoods, through people experimenting with leather, grass, bark, and other natural materials, through craftsmen improving frames, through inventors replacing heavy components with lighter ones, and through ordinary people who slowly decided that carrying their own little roof was actually worth it. The most remarkable thing is that humans never really solved rain with a single invention. They solved it thousands of times. A cave, a roof, a cloak, a hood, a woven mat, a treated canopy, a waterproof garment, and finally, the umbrella. Each one was a small answer to the same ancient problem. The sky will do whatever it wants. So humans learned to build something underneath it. And that is why, when the first drops of rain hit the ground and you open an umbrella today, you're not using a modern idea at all. You're continuing one of humanity's oldest habits, looking at a problem in nature, and finding a way to keep going anyway.